The forgotten terror, when Vikings met their match in the frozen north. Blood freezes differently in the Arctic darkness, not in the dramatic crystalline patterns of sudden death, but in the slow, creeping horror of realization that you, the hunter, have become the hunted, that your longships and battle axes mean nothing in a world where the very air can kill and the forests have eyes that never blink. This was the nightmare that haunted the most feared warriors of medieval Europe. The Vikings, conquerors of kingdoms and masters of the northern seas, reduced to trembling children by an enemy they could neither understand nor defeat, a people whose very existence challenged everything the Norse believed about warfare, power, and their place in the world order. Picture the scene that unfolded countless times in the frozen wasteland beyond the edge of the known world. A Viking warband, 30 strong, armed with the finest weapons their raids could procure, moving through the endless forest in search of wealth and glory, their breath forming clouds in air so cold it burned their lungs, their confidence bolstered by victories across half of Europe. They never heard the arrows coming, never saw the figures that moved through the trees like shadows given form, never understood how their sentries could die without a sound, their throats opened by blades that left no trace of their wielders, only strange marks in the snow that seemed to mock the very concept of human tracks. By morning, half the warband was dead. The survivors huddled around a dying fire, too terrified to sleep, too lost to retreat, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, something watched and waited, something that killed with a patience and precision that made their own brutal raids seem like the fumbling of children playing at war. These were not demons or spirits, though the Vikings would come to believe they were. These were the Bjarmaland people, the forgotten tribe of the uttermost north, masters of a land so hostile that merely surviving in it required skills the Vikings had never imagined, wielders of weapons more subtle than any sword, practitioners of a warfare that turned the Norse advantages into fatal weaknesses. Their story has been buried beneath centuries of historical focus on Viking conquests and Christian conversion, relegated to footnotes and dismissed as mere folklore. Yet, the archaeological evidence tells a different tale, one of a sophisticated culture that achieved what no European kingdom could manage. They stopped the Vikings cold, literally and figuratively. In the sagas and chronicles that survive from the Viking Age, mentions of Bjarmaland carry a weight of dread unusual in Norse literature. These were people who wrote proudly of facing berserkers and storm giants. Yet, their accounts of the Bjarmaland drip with a fear that goes beyond mere respect for a worthy enemy. The land beyond the north wind belongs to those who are not truly men, wrote one anonymous chronicler. They move without sound through snows that would swallow a horse. They see in darkness as cats do. They speak to the spirits of the forest, and the spirits answer. Wise men avoid their territory, and even the bravest warriors find reasons to sail elsewhere when Bjarmaland is mentioned. This was more than superstition, though the Vikings would wrap their fear in supernatural explanations rather than admit they had been outmatched by what they considered a primitive people. The reality was that the Bjarmaland had developed a civilization perfectly adapted to their environment, one that made them virtually unassailable in their homeland. The collision between Viking ambition and Bjarmaland resistance created one of the most fascinating yet overlooked chapters in medieval history, a story of how environmental mastery could trump military might, how psychological warfare could defeat physical courage, and how a smaller, less technologically advanced culture could preserve its independence against one of history's most successful expansionist civilizations. To understand this remarkable story, we must first comprehend the world that created both these peoples, the harsh realities of survival in the far north that shaped such different yet equally formidable cultures, and the inevitable conflict that arose when their worlds collided. The Viking Age, spanning roughly from 793 to 1066 CE, represents one of the most dynamic periods in European history, when Scandinavian peoples burst from their northern homelands to raid, trade, and settle across a vast geographic area, their influence reaching from Greenland to the Caspian Sea, from the North Atlantic to the Mediterranean. These were not mindless barbarians, despite the terrified accounts of their victims, but sophisticated maritime cultures that combined military prowess with commercial acumen, technological innovation with artistic achievement, creating trade networks that connected diverse civilizations and established settlements that would grow into major cities. The Viking expansion was driven by multiple factors, including population pressure, political consolidation in Scandinavia, climatic changes that made agriculture more difficult, and the development of superior shipbuilding technology that gave them unprecedented mobility and military advantage. Their society was complex and stratified, with jarls, carls, and thralls occupying distinct social positions, bound together by intricate webs of loyalty, kinship, and honor that placed tremendous emphasis on individual reputation and martial achievement, creating a culture where death in battle was preferable to life with dishonor. By the 9th century, Viking influence had spread across Europe like wildfire. They had established kingdoms in England and Ireland, were pressing into Francia, had created the state that would become Russia, and were serving as mercenaries from Byzantium to Baghdad, adapting to local conditions while maintaining their distinctive cultural identity. Yet, for all their adaptability and success, there were limits to Viking expansion, geographical barriers they could not overcome, peoples that they could not conquer, and one of the most significant of these limits lay in the frozen forests of the far north, in the land they called Bjarmaland. The territory of Bjarmaland encompassed what is now northern Finland, the Kola Peninsula, and parts of northwestern Russia, a vast expanse of forest, tundra, and frozen rivers that presented challenges unlike anything the Vikings encountered elsewhere in their travels. This was not the relatively mild climate of Denmark or southern Norway, where the Vikings had developed their agricultural and maritime civilization, nor was it like the river valleys of Russia or the coasts of England, where their military tactics and trading practices could be easily adapted. Bjarmaland was a world apart, where winter temperatures could plummet to levels that would kill the unprepared in hours, where the sun disappeared entirely for months at a time, where the forests were so vast and trackless that entire armies could vanish without trace, swallowed by a green darkness that seemed to have no end. The people who called this harsh land home had adapted to it over millennia, developing technologies, social structures, and spiritual practices that allowed them not just to survive, but to thrive in conditions that would defeat most human populations. Archaeological evidence suggests the Bjarmaland people were related to the broader Finno-Ugric language family, sharing linguistic and cultural connections with the Sami, Finns, and other northern peoples, yet maintaining their own distinct identity, shaped by their particular environment and historical experience. Unlike the Vikings, who were primarily farmers and seafarers, the Bjarmaland were hunters, fishers, and reindeer herders who followed seasonal patterns of movement through their territory, exploiting different resources as they became available and maintaining a sustainable relationship with their challenging environment. Their society appears to have been less hierarchical than the Viking model, with leadership based on practical skills, spiritual authority, and wisdom rather than hereditary privilege or martial prowess, creating a more flexible and adaptive social structure that could respond quickly to threats and opportunities. The spiritual life of the Bjarmaland was intimately connected to their environment, with a complex shamanic tradition that saw the natural world as inhabited by spirits that could be communicated with, placated, or invoked through proper rituals and practices, a worldview that would profoundly unsettle the Vikings who encountered it. This was the stage upon which one of history's most unusual conflicts would play out, not a clash of mighty armies or a struggle for imperial domination, but a grinding, centuries-long confrontation between two fundamentally different approaches to life, warfare and survival. The Vikings came seeking what they had found elsewhere: wealth to plunder, land to settle, trade routes to control, and peoples to subjugate or incorporate into their expanding network of influence and power. What they found instead was an enemy unlike any they had faced before, one that refused to meet them in open battle where Viking superiority in weapons and tactics would prove decisive, one that used the very landscape as a weapon, one that fought with methods that violated every Norse concept of honorable warfare. The story of how the Bjarmaland people not only resisted Viking expansion, but actively terrorized the terrorizers themselves, reveals fundamental truths about the nature of power, the importance of environmental adaptation, and the limits of military technology when confronted with perfect knowledge of local conditions. Masters of the White Death. The first lesson the Vikings learned about Bjarmaland came wrapped in the bitter embrace of an Arctic wind that cut through their wool cloaks as if they were made of gossamer, carrying with it the promise that this land would kill them not with sword or spear, but with the inexorable patience of endless cold. Environmental mastery begins not with grand strategies or sophisticated technologies, but with the accumulation of countless small adaptations, each one representing a victory over death, a lesson learned through suffering, a piece of knowledge that meant the difference between survival and becoming another frozen corpse lost to the wilderness. The Bjarmaland people had spent millennia learning these lessons, their entire culture shaped by the demands of their homeland, every aspect of their material culture, social organization, and spiritual practice reflecting the requirements of life in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Consider first their mastery of movement through a landscape that defeated Viking mobility at every turn, where longships were useless for 9 months of the year, when rivers froze solid, where horses foundered in deep snow or broke their legs on hidden ice, where even walking could exhaust a man in minutes as he fought through drifts that reached above his head. The Bjarmaland had solved this problem with technologies so perfectly adapted to their environment that modern versions have barely improved on the ancient designs. Skis that distributed weight across snow's surface, allowing rapid movement where others would flounder. Snowshoes for different conditions and terrains. Sleds that could carry enormous loads with minimal effort. But technology alone does not explain their advantage. What mattered was how completely these tools were integrated into daily life. How children learned to ski before they could properly walk. How hunters could cover 50 miles in a day through terrain that would stop a Viking warband in its tracks. The archaeological record reveals skis of various designs, each optimized for specific purposes. racing skis for open tundra, shorter, wider skis for maneuvering through forests, specialized skis for climbing slopes, and others designed for maximum stability when drawing a bow, a level of specialization that speaks to centuries of refinement. Their clothing represented another dimension of environmental mastery. While Vikings relied primarily on wool, an excellent material, but one with limitations in extreme conditions, the Bjarmaland had developed a sophisticated understanding of how different materials performed in various situations. Layering was not just a concept, but a science, with undergarments of soft furs that trapped air for insulation, middle layers of tightly woven materials that blocked wind, and outer layers that could shed snow and ice while remaining flexible at temperatures that would make leather crack like old pottery. They understood that the different animals provided different qualities of fur and hide. Seal skin for waterproof outer garments, reindeer hide for flexible clothing that remained supple in cold, bear fur for maximum warmth, fox and marten for lightweight insulation, each material used where its properties were most valuable. The construction of their garments showed remarkable sophistication, with seams designed to prevent heat loss, hoods that could be adjusted to protect against wind from any direction, mittens connected by strings so they couldn't be lost, and boots that kept feet warm and dry through days of travel through snow and slush. But perhaps their greatest achievement in clothing was understanding the deadly danger of sweat in cold conditions, and designing garments that could be easily adjusted for ventilation during exertion, preventing the buildup of moisture that could freeze and kill when activity stopped. Their shelters represented another level of adaptation entirely. Structures that could be erected quickly in blizzard conditions, provide warmth with minimal fuel, and be broken down and transported as they moved through their territory, following game and seasonal resources. These ranged from permanent winter lodges, partially underground and insulated with layers of turf and snow, to temporary shelters made from bent saplings covered with hides or bark, each design reflecting specific needs and available materials. The placement of these structures showed a deep understanding of microclimates and weather patterns, avoiding wind funnels and avalanche zones, taking advantage of natural wind breaks and sun exposure, positioned near resources but hidden from easy discovery by enemies. Inside, the arrangement of space maximized heat retention while allowing for necessary activities, with sleeping areas positioned to capture rising warm air, workspaces near light sources, and storage areas that used the cold to preserve food while keeping it accessible. Fire management in these structures was an art form, using specific woods that burned hot with minimal smoke, arranging stones to absorb and radiate heat, creating draft systems that drew smoke out while pulling minimal warm air, maintaining comfort in spaces that seemed impossibly small to Vikings accustomed to their long hauls. The Bjarmaland understanding of their environment extended beyond mere survival to active exploitation of its resources. They knew where animals sheltered in storms, how to read weather patterns days in advance, which plants remained edible beneath the snow, where fish gathered under ice. This knowledge was encoded not in written texts, but in oral traditions, stories, and songs that transmitted crucial information across generations, wrapped in narrative forms that made them memorable and ensured their preservation, even if individual knowledge holders were lost. Their ability to navigate in conditions that left Vikings hopelessly lost seemed almost supernatural, using subtle cues invisible to outsiders, the way snow accumulated on trees indicating direction, the sound of wind through branches revealing location, the behavior of birds signaling weather changes. They had names for dozens of different types of snow and ice, each indicating specific conditions, dangers, or opportunities, a vocabulary that reflected their intimate relationship with their environment and allowed precise communication about conditions that Vikings could only describe in general terms. The seasonal round of Bjarmaland life was precisely calibrated to their environment, moving between established territories as resources became available, never overexploiting any area, maintaining a sustainable relationship with their homeland that had endured for millennia. Summer saw them spread across their territory in smaller groups, fishing, hunting, gathering plants and berries, preparing for the long winter, while that season brought them together in winter camps, where social bonds were reinforced and knowledge transmitted to the next generation. This mobility was not random wandering, but followed ancient patterns encoded in cultural memory, paths between seasonal camps that had been used for generations, modified as needed, but maintaining a basic structure that ensured access to crucial resources throughout the year. The Bjarmaland had learned to see their environment not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a partner in survival, working with natural patterns rather than against them, accepting limitations while exploiting every opportunity their homeland provided. This fundamental difference in worldview created an asymmetric advantage that no amount of Viking military might could overcome. In Bjarmaland, the environment itself fought on the side of its native inhabitants, and it was an enemy that never tired, never retreated, and never negotiated. When Vikings entered this alien landscape, they found themselves stripped of every advantage that made them formidable elsewhere. Their superior weapons were of little use against an enemy they couldn't find. Their armor became a freezing liability. Their very presence in the landscape, announced by their inability to move through it efficiently. The psychological impact of this reversal cannot be overstated. Warriors who had faced death unflinchingly on battlefields across Europe found themselves reduced to frightened men jumping at shadows, knowing that death could come at any moment from any direction, delivered by an enemy that seemed one with the landscape itself. Every Viking expedition into Bjarmaland became a masterclass in how environmental mastery could defeat military superiority, how intimate knowledge of place could overcome advantages in weapons and numbers, how a people perfectly adapted to their homeland could turn that homeland into an unconquerable fortress. The art of invisible war, as the Vikings understood it, was a public performance of courage and skill, where warriors sought glory through conspicuous bravery, where battles were preceded by boasts and challenges, where death in combat guaranteed entry to Valhalla and eternal fame in the songs of skalds. The Bjarmaland people fought by entirely different rules that made a mockery of Viking martial values and turned their greatest strengths into fatal weaknesses, creating a form of warfare so alien to Norse understanding that many Vikings came to believe they faced supernatural enemies rather than mortal men. Imagine a war where battles never occurred, where enemies struck without warning and vanished without trace, where the greatest victory was killing without being seen, where survival trumped glory and efficiency, replaced honor as the highest martial virtue. This was the reality of Bjarmaland warfare, a systematic approach to combat that maximized their environmental advantages while minimizing exposure to Viking strengths, turning the forests and tundra into a killing ground where traditional military tactics became suicidal folly. The foundation of Bjarmaland military doctrine was the principle of invisible presence, the ability to observe, track, and strike Viking forces while remaining undetected, a skill that required not just individual prowess but coordinated effort, across entire communities. When Viking expeditions entered Bjarmaland territory, they were under observation from the moment they crossed the frontier, watched by scouts who could shadow them for days without detection, reporting their movements, strengths, and weaknesses to defenders who prepared appropriate responses. These scouts were not warriors in the Viking sense, but hunters whose skills had been refined through generations of stalking the most alert and sensitive prey. Men and women who could move through forest and snow with less disturbance than wind through branches, the art of tracking, reading the subtle signs that revealed not just where someone had been, but when, how many they numbered, how heavily they were laden. Their state of health and morale became a weapon more devastating than any sword when wielded by those who had mastered it. The Bjarmaland could read Viking intentions from their tracks, knowing from the depth and spacing of footprints whether men moved confidently or fearfully, whether they searched for something specific or wandered lost, whether they prepared for battle or focused on survival. This intelligence gathering allowed Bjarmaland defenders to always choose the time and place of engagement, striking when Vikings were most vulnerable, during blizzards that masked sound and movement, at river crossings where men were separated and exposed. In the exhausted hours before dawn, when sentries dozed at their posts, the weapons of Bjarmaland warriors reflected their combat philosophy. Lightweight bows that could be drawn while skiing, arrows designed for silence and accuracy rather than armor penetration, spears balanced for throwing from concealment, knives shaped for instant, silent killing. Archaeological evidence reveals arrowheads of distinctive design, with barbed points that would catch in clothing and flesh, making removal difficult and increasing blood loss. While their slim profile allowed them to slip between links of mail that would stop heavier Viking arrows, the tactics employed by Bjarmaland fighters would be familiar to modern special forces, but were revolutionary in medieval warfare. Ambushes that struck simultaneously from multiple directions, targeted killings of leaders and specialists, harassment that wore down enemy morale without risking decisive engagement. One of their most effective tactics was the false retreat, appearing briefly to Viking forces, firing a few arrows, then fleeing in apparent panic, drawing pursuers into prepared killing grounds where hidden fighters waited. Terrain that channeled movement into zones pre-registered for archery, the psychological impact of these tactics was devastating. Vikings never knew when attack might come, never saw their enemies long enough to engage them properly, never could predict what form the next assault would take, creating a constant state of stress that eroded judgment and morale. Sleep deprivation became a weapon as Bjarmaland fighters harassed Viking camps throughout the night. A few arrows from the darkness, strange sounds that might be animals or might be attackers. Sentries found dead at their posts with no sign of how death had come. The bodies of slain Vikings were often arranged in disturbing patterns, left where they would be found by their comrades, positioned to maximize psychological impact, creating scenes that suggested ritual killing or supernatural intervention rather than military action. This deliberate cultivation of fear was not random but carefully calculated. The Bjarmaland understood that frightened men made poor decisions, and that warriors who believed they faced demons rather than men would break more easily than those who understood their enemy. The winter landscape itself became a weapon in Bjarmaland hands. They knew how to trigger small avalanches that would bury Viking camps, how to weaken ice so it would break under the weight of armored men, how to use blizzards as cover for infiltration and attack. Fire, the essential element for survival in the Arctic, became a vulnerability that Bjarmaland fighters exploited mercilessly, targeting Viking fuel supplies, forcing them to venture farther from camp for firewood, attacking when men were divided between those maintaining fires and those gathering wood. The mobility differential between Bjarmaland fighters on skis and Vikings floundering through snow created tactical opportunities that modern military theorists would recognize as maneuver warfare. The ability to concentrate forces rapidly at chosen points, then disperse before counterattack was possible. Communication between Bjarmaland groups used methods invisible to Vikings. Drum signals that carried for miles through forest, smoke signs that conveyed complex messages, trail markers that looked like natural features but encoded information about enemy movements and planned responses. The command structure of Bjarmaland forces was fluid and adaptable, based on expertise rather than formal rank, with leadership shifting based on specific situations, the best tracker leading during pursuit, the best archer commanding during ambush, the most experienced in Viking tactics coordinating defensive actions. Training for this style of warfare began in childhood, with games that developed necessary skills, contests of silent movement, tracking exercises, archery practice under difficult conditions, endurance challenges that prepared young people for the physical demands of their combat style. The sexual integration of Bjarmaland fighting forces added another element that confused Viking understanding. Women who could match men in archery and woodland skills, who participated fully in defensive operations, whose presence in combat violated Norse assumptions about gender and warfare. Logistics for Bjarmaland operations were minimal compared to Viking requirements. Fighters carried days of food in compact, high-energy forms, cached supplies throughout their territory, lived off the land with skills Vikings couldn't match, maintaining operational capability with a fraction of the supply train Viking forces required. The Bjarmaland understanding of Viking psychology allowed them to exploit Norse concepts of honor and shame, using tactics that would force Vikings into disadvantageous positions rather than accept what they saw as cowardly withdrawal, turning martial values into tactical liabilities. Deception operations reached sophisticated levels, with false camps designed to draw Viking attacks, tracks laid to lead enemies in circles or into ambush sites, even entire fake settlements constructed to waste Viking time and resources in attacking empty objectives. The integration of spiritual practices into military operations added another layer Vikings found disturbing, with shamanic rituals performed before operations, spiritual protections invoked for fighters, ceremonies that seemed to blur the line between warfare and magic in Viking perception, intelligence networks that included traders, travelers, and even Vikings themselves, who had established peaceful relations with Bjarmaland communities, provided early warning of expeditions, allowing defensive preparations that often began before Vikings had even finalized their plans. The cumulative effect of Bjarmaland tactics was to make Viking operations in their territory prohibitively expensive in lives and resources. Even successful raids often cost more than they gained, while failed expeditions could result in complete annihilation of Viking forces. This invisible war challenged everything Vikings believed about combat and honor, forcing them to confront an enemy that refused to play by their rules, that turned their strengths against them, that made mockery of their martial values while systematically destroying their ability to project power. The lessons of Bjarmaland warfare would influence military thinking in the region for centuries, as other peoples adopted similar tactics against conventionally superior enemies, proving that technological and numerical advantages could be neutralized by superior adaptation to environment and innovative tactical thinking. For the Vikings, accustomed to enemies who either stood and fought or fled in terror, The Bjarmaland way of war represented something deeply disturbing, a challenge not just to their military dominance, but to their entire worldview, their understanding of how civilized people should conduct themselves in conflict. Shamans, spirits, and psychological domination. Terror has many faces, but for the Vikings venturing into Bjarmaland, it wore the painted visage of shamans who seemed to command forces beyond human understanding, who performed rituals that violated every boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds, who transformed warfare from a contest of strength into a battle for sanity itself. The psychological warfare employed by the Bjarmaland people represented perhaps their most sophisticated weapon, one that struck at the very core of Viking identity and left scars that no amount of physical courage could heal, creating fears that followed warriors home to haunt their dreams long after they had fled the northern forests. To understand the devastating effectiveness of Bjarmaland's psychological operations, we must first comprehend the spiritual worldview they exploited, the complex intersection of Norse paganism, emerging Christianity, and the deep-seated fears that lurked in the medieval mind when confronted with the unknown. Vikings lived in a world populated by supernatural forces, where gods walked among men, where the boundaries between life and death were permeable, where magic was real but dangerous, usually confined to specific contexts and practitioners who commanded mixture of respect and suspicion. The Bjarmaland shamanic tradition operated by entirely different rules, permeating every aspect of daily life in ways the Vikings found deeply unsettling, suggesting a people who lived partially in the spirit world, who commanded forces that Norse magic users only dared invoke in extremity. Archaeological evidence reveals the tools of this tradition: drums made from reindeer hide stretched over frames of sacred wood, painted with symbols that hurt the eyes to follow, masks that transformed human faces into nightmare amalgamations of man and beast, costumes that suggested the wearer had stepped partially out of human form. The drums were not mere instruments, but technological devices for consciousness alteration, their rhythms calibrated through centuries of experimentation to induce trance states, their decorations encoding cosmological maps that guided shamanic journeys through spiritual landscapes Vikings could not imagine. When Bjarmaland shamans performed their rituals within sight or hearing of Viking forces, the effect was calculatedly devastating. Warriors who would face berserkers without flinching found themselves unmanned by displays that seemed to violate the natural order. That suggested their enemies commanded powers beyond sword or shield to combat. The shamanic ceremonies often began at dusk, that liminal time when the ordinary world grew thin, with practitioners donning their ritual garments in elaborate sequences that transformed them, step by step, from recognizable humans into something other, something that existed between categories. Fire played a central role, not the comfortable hearth fire Vikings knew, but wild, dancing flames fed with substances that produced colored smoke and strange scents, creating visual and olfactory environments that disoriented observers and suggested passage into otherworldly spaces. The movements of shamans in ritual were precisely choreographed, yet seemed spontaneous. Violent contortions that should have been impossible for human bodies, gestures that appeared to pull invisible forces from air and earth, dances that moved between human and animal gaits with fluid transitions that defied classification. Vocalizations accompanied these movements, not the chanted prayers Vikings knew from their own religious practices, but sounds that seemed to emerge from inhuman throats, growls and whistles and harmonics that raised primitive fears, that spoke to parts of the mind civilization had not touched, the presence of preserved bodies, the mummified ancestors that Bjarmaland communities maintained, added another layer of horror for Viking observers. These were not the clean bones of proper burial nor the ashes of cremation, but something between, faces that retained expression, bodies that seemed poised to move during certain ceremonies. These preserved ancestors were brought out and positioned among the living, creating gatherings where the dead outnumbered the living, where shamans appeared to converse with mummies that Vikings swore they saw move, though whether through trickery or supernatural power none could say. The animal transformation rituals were perhaps most disturbing to Viking sensibilities. Ceremonies where participants donned pelts and masks, and gradually took on the movements and sounds of wolves, bears, and other predators, until observers could no longer clearly distinguish between human and beast. These transformations were not the berserk fury Vikings knew, where warriors temporarily took on beast-like qualities in battle rage, but something more controlled and complete, suggesting that Bjarmaland shamans could move between species at will, becoming fully animal while retaining human intelligence. The psychological impact was amplified by the settings chosen for these displays, clearings that Vikings would stumble upon that showed evidence of recent ritual activity, arrangements of skulls and antlers that created geometric patterns, trees carved with symbols that seemed to watch, spaces that felt fundamentally wrong to enter. Sound carried far in the still northern forests, and Bjarmaland shamans exploited this, performing ceremonies at distances where Vikings could hear but not see, creating acoustic environments of drums, chants, and inhuman sounds that seemed to come from all directions, suggesting forces gathering in the darkness. The timing of psychological operations showed sophisticated understanding of human stress responses, with activity intensifying when Viking forces were already strained by cold, hunger, or recent combat losses, when mental defenses were weakest and suggestibility highest. Individual targeting added another dimension of terror, with Vikings finding personal items they thought securely stored appearing in ritual contexts, their own names woven into overheard chants, suggestions that Bjarmaland shamans knew not just their presence but their identities, their histories, their fears. The use of psychoactive substances, while never definitively proven, seems likely given the reported effects of some encounters. Vikings describing visual distortions, time dilation, overwhelming fear without apparent cause, symptoms consistent with exposure to compounds derived from local mushrooms or plants. Dream warfare represented another front in the psychological campaign, with Vikings reporting shared nightmares after encounters with Bjarmaland shamans. Dreams where the boundaries between sleep and waking became unclear, where dead comrades appeared with messages, where animal spirits invaded human bodies. The shaman's apparent ability to predict Viking movements and appear where they should not have known to go reinforced supernatural explanations, though modern analysis suggests sophisticated intelligence networks and environmental knowledge rather than actual prescience. Weather seemed to obey shamanic commands, with storms arising when Bjarmaland defenders needed cover, fog materializing to conceal their movements, conditions that had natural explanations but appeared supernatural to Vikings already primed to see divine or demonic intervention. The integration of psychological warfare with physical attacks multiplied their effectiveness. Vikings weakened by fear and sleep deprivation made easier targets, while the attribution of military defeats to supernatural causes prevented rational analysis of Bjarmaland tactics. Some Viking expeditions experienced what modern psychology would recognize as collective trauma responses, entire groups sharing delusions, panic attacks spreading through camps like contagion, hardened warriors, breaking down in tears or catatonic states, symptoms that persisted long after return to home territories. The reputation of Bjarmaland shamans became self-reinforcing as stories spread through Viking communities, each telling adding embellishments, until the mere mention of northern sorcerers could deter expeditions, creating defensive barriers of fear more effective than any physical fortification. Countermeasures attempted by Vikings, including Christian prayers, pagan protective rituals, and attempts to maintain skepticism, proved largely ineffective against sustained psychological operations that exploited deep-seated fears and cultural assumptions about the nature of reality. The sophistication of Bjarmaland psychological warfare suggests systematic development over generations, refined techniques passed down through shamanic lineages, innovations in response to Viking adaptations, creating an arms race in the realm of mind rather than matter. Documentation of these encounters in sagas and chronicles, while filtered through Norse cultural perspectives and later Christian interpretations, consistently depicts Bjarmaland shamans as figures of terror who commanded forces beyond normal human experience, testimony to the lasting impact of their psychological operations. The legacy of this psychological dominance extended beyond immediate military effects, influencing Norse mythology, contributing to the evolution of Viking spiritual practices, and creating a template for asymmetric psychological warfare that would echo through centuries of conflict between indigenous peoples and invading forces. For individual Vikings who experienced Bjarmaland psychological operations, the effects could be career-ending. Warriors who returned speaking of northern horrors often found themselves unable to maintain their martial reputation, their accounts dismissed as cowardice or madness by those who had not witnessed what they had seen. The true genius of Bjarmaland psychological warfare lay not in any supernatural powers, but in the systematic exploitation of Viking fears and assumptions, using theater, environmental manipulation, and deep understanding of human psychology to create effects that seemed magical to those who experienced them. This transformation of warfare from physical to psychological battleground represented an evolution in military thinking that would not be fully understood or replicated for centuries. Proof that the most sophisticated weapons are not always made of steel, that the greatest victories can be won in the mind before a single arrow is fired. The economics of fear and fur. Gold has driven men to madness throughout history, but in the frozen reaches of Bjarmaland, it was not yellow metal, but the soft pelts of Arctic creatures that created an economic tension, powerful enough to override even the terror that northern shamans had instilled in Viking hearts. The paradox of Bjarmaland trade reveals fundamental truths about human nature and economic necessity, how the desire for luxury goods could overcome profound fear, how commercial relationships could exist alongside military hostility, and how control over rare resources could provide leverage that military might alone could never achieve. To understand this complex economic dance, we must first appreciate what made Bjarmaland furs so valuable that Vikings would risk their lives and sanity to obtain them, what transformed simple animal pelts into objects of desire that could purchase kingdoms or seal alliances across half the known world. The Arctic fox, sable, and marten that thrived in Bjarmaland's forests produced fur of quality unmatched anywhere else in medieval Europe, pelts so fine they seemed to capture light within their depths, so warm they could protect against cold that would kill through lesser garments, so beautiful they became symbols of power and prestige. A single black fox pelt, perfect and properly prepared, could be worth more than a skilled craftsman earned in a year, while a matched set suitable for trimming a royal robe might equal the price of a small farm or a modest ship, creating economic incentives that overwhelmed rational risk assessment. The Bjarmaland people understood perfectly the value of what their homeland produced and developed sophisticated systems for harvesting, processing, and controlling access to these resources, turning their environmental mastery into economic power that forced even the feared Vikings to negotiate rather than simply take. Archaeological evidence from trading sites reveals the complexity of fur preparation techniques, specialized tools for removing pelts without damage, tanning methods that preserved suppleness while preventing decay, sorting systems that graded furs by quality with precision that matched modern standards. The seasonal nature of fur quality added another dimension to Bjarmaland economic control. They knew precisely when each species' coat reached prime condition, information they guarded jealously and used to maintain advantage over Viking traders who lacked such intimate knowledge. Beyond furs, Bjarmaland territory yielded other treasures that commanded premium prices in medieval markets. Walrus ivory, superior to elephant tusks for carving. Amber with insects preserved like jeweled memories. Gerfalcons, whose hunting prowess made them fit gifts for emperors. The Bjarmaland also dealt in more esoteric goods whose value lay in belief rather than utility. Amulets that supposedly protected against harm. Medicines derived from Arctic plants and fungi. Substances that claimed to enhance virility or extend life. Trading on the reputation for supernatural knowledge. This rich array of trade goods created a fundamental tension in Viking-Bjarmaland relations. Norse merchants desperately wanted access to these resources, while Bjarmaland communities were equally determined to maintain control over their exploitation and distribution, creating an economic standoff as complex as any military confrontation. The solution that evolved was a series of trading protocols that balanced fear with greed, hostility with necessity, creating some of the most unusual commercial arrangements in medieval history. Markets that operated under supernatural sanction where normal rules of both commerce and warfare were temporarily suspended. These trading sessions took place at carefully chosen locations on the borders between Viking and Bjarmaland territories, neutral grounds established by tradition and protected by ritual, where both sides could meet without fear of ambush, though never without suspicion. The timing of these markets was precise, usually during the brief Arctic summer when travel was easiest, and furs were being prepared for transport, announced by signs and messengers, using protocols that had evolved over generations of cautious contact. Archaeological excavations at these trading sites reveal fascinating details about their operation. Designated areas for each group, marked by posts and stones. Fire pits positioned to provide warmth without creating advantage for either side. Even specialized structures for displaying goods that allowed examination without requiring direct hand-to-hand exchange. The opening of trading sessions involved elaborate rituals that both sides participated in, ceremonies that invoked spiritual sanctions against violence, oaths sworn on objects sacred to both cultures, demonstrations that weapons had been laid aside, creating temporary sacred spaces where commerce could override conflict. Viking traders brought goods that Bjarmaland communities could not produce themselves. Iron tools and weapons, colored cloth that brightened the monochrome northern landscape, silver coins that served as portable wealth, salt and spices that enhanced preserved foods, luxury items that demonstrated status. The negotiation process itself became ritualized, with specific protocols for examining goods, making offers, and concluding deals, all designed to minimize direct contact and reduce opportunities for conflict while allowing necessary commercial interaction. Bjarmaland traders, often elderly women whose age and gender made them less threatening to Viking sensibilities, while commanding respect in their own culture, displayed formidable commercial acumen, testing silver for purity, examining cloth for quality, rejecting inferior goods with disdain that transcended language barriers. The language of trade developed its own vocabulary, a pidgin combining Norse, Bjarmaland, and borrowed terms that allowed complex negotiations while maintaining cultural boundaries. Words for quality, quantity, and types of goods, but deliberately lacking terms for military or territorial concepts. Price discovery in these markets reflected more than simple supply and demand, incorporating complex factors, including the success of recent hunts, the political situation in Viking territories, the phase of ongoing conflicts, and even spiritual considerations that might make certain goods taboo at specific times. The Bjarmaland practice of bringing shamans to trading sessions added another layer of complexity. These spiritual authorities serving multiple roles as quality assessors who verified the authenticity of magical goods, arbitrators who resolved disputes, and implicit threats who reminded Vikings of the supernatural sanctions protecting the market. Viking attempts to circumvent these controlled markets through independent trading expeditions met with consistent failure. Bjarmaland communities maintained strict territorial control, punishing unauthorized intrusions with the same deadly efficiency they applied to military raids, making clear that commercial access required adherence to established protocols. The economics of intermediary trade created additional complications, with some groups specializing in moving goods between Bjarmaland sources and Viking markets, adding markup but also risk, as they had to maintain good relations with both sides while protecting their own interests. These intermediaries, often of mixed heritage or from smaller ethnic groups that maintained neutrality, developed their own trading networks and intelligence systems, becoming powerful players who could influence prices and availability across the entire northern trade system. The seasonal nature of Bjarmaland trade created boom-bust cycles in Viking markets, with fur prices spiking in years when trading was disrupted by conflict, creating economic incentives for both peace and war, depending on who held inventory and who needed supplies. Credit systems evolved to handle the temporal mismatch between Viking demand and Bjarmaland supply, with complex arrangements involving future delivery promises, collateral held by neutral parties, and reputation-based trust networks that could be destroyed by single defaults. The impact of Bjarmaland trade extended far beyond the immediate participants. Furs and other northern goods flowed through Viking networks to markets in Constantinople, Baghdad, and London, creating wealth that funded Viking expansion while paradoxically strengthening the Bjarmaland economy. Documentation of trades, while not written in the modern sense, existed in the form of marked tally sticks, seal impressions, and mnemonic devices that allowed both sides to track obligations and histories, creating commercial memory that persisted across generations. The gendered dimension of trade negotiations reflected different cultural values, with Bjarmaland women holding prominent commercial roles that challenged Viking assumptions while creating opportunities for interaction that military hostility would have prevented. Children often accompanied trading parties on both sides, learning through observation the protocols and skills necessary for future participation, ensuring continuity of commercial relationships even as political and military situations evolved. The material culture of trade left distinctive archaeological signatures, with Viking goods found deep in Bjarmaland territory and northern products in Scandinavian sites, mapping exchange networks that persisted despite ongoing conflicts. Specialized containers and packaging developed for the fur trade, designed to protect valuable pelts during transport while allowing inspection without handling, represent technological innovations driven by commercial needs that influenced broader developments in medieval logistics. The financial instruments that evolved from Bjarmaland trade, including early forms of commodity futures and risk-sharing arrangements, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of commercial principles that would not be formally theorized for centuries. Competition among Viking traders for access to Bjarmaland goods created internal conflicts that sometimes exceeded external hostilities, with Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish merchants maneuvering for advantage, occasionally cooperating against common threats, but more often undermining each other. The Bjarmaland response to this competition showed shrewd commercial instincts, playing different Viking groups against each other, maintaining multiple trading relationships to ensure no single Norse power could monopolize access. Preserving their independence through economic leverage, religious differences added complexity to trade relationships. As Christianity spread through Viking territories, while Bjarmaland maintained traditional practices, creating situations where Christian merchants had to participate in pagan rituals to access markets, challenging their spiritual commitments. The evolution of standard weights and measures for trade goods, necessary for fair exchange between cultures with different systems, represents early international commercial standardization, with archaeological finds of balance scales and weight sets showing remarkable consistency. Fraud and deception occurred on both sides, despite ritual sanctions, with Vikings attempting to pass inferior goods and Bjarmaland traders occasionally mixing lower-quality furs with premium ones, creating needs for verification systems and reputation tracking that influenced later commercial law. The economic impact of successful trading seasons versus disrupted ones could be traced throughout Northern Europe, with fur shortages creating price spikes that affected diplomatic gifts, royal ceremonies, and social status displays, demonstrating how Bjarmaland resources influenced medieval political economy. Attempts by various Viking leaders to monopolize or control Bjarmaland trade through force consistently failed, teaching hard lessons about the limits of military power when confronting environmentally adapted peoples who controlled critical resources. The gradual evolution from hostile confrontation to regulated trade represents a model for how economic interests can moderate conflict, though in the Bjarmaland case, this moderation never extended to full peace, maintaining instead a tense equilibrium between commercial cooperation and military antagonism. The legacy of Bjarmaland trade patterns influenced Northern European commerce for centuries, establishing precedents for trading with indigenous peoples, managing hostile commercial relationships, and balancing economic needs with security concerns that would echo through the colonial period. By maintaining control over their resources while engaging in limited trade, the Bjarmaland people achieved what military resistance alone could not have accomplished. They forced the Vikings to acknowledge them as equals in the commercial sphere, partners who could not be conquered or displaced, but had to be negotiated with on terms of mutual benefit. This economic dimension of Viking Bjarmaland relations reveals the complexity of medieval frontier interactions, where trade and war, cooperation and conflict, fear and greed existed in dynamic tension, creating relationships that defied simple categorization as either hostile or peaceful. The true measure of Bjarmaland's success lay not in the wealth they accumulated through trade, but in how they used economic leverage to maintain political independence and cultural integrity, turning what could have been purely extractive colonial relationships into exchanges that preserved their autonomy. When Viking merchants hefted those precious furs, feeling their impossible softness and knowing the prices they would command in distant markets, they held in their hands not just valuable commodities, but physical proof of Bjarmaland power, resources that could only be obtained through negotiation with people who refused to be conquered. Warriors without gender. In the flickering firelight of a Bjarmaland winter camp, a figure rises to address the assembled warriors, tall and commanding, with scars that speak of battles won and enemies defeated, wearing the marks of leadership with natural authority. And this warrior, this leader of fighters who have sent Vikings fleeing in terror, is a woman. Nothing in the Viking worldview had prepared them for this reality, for women who commanded not through the reflected authority of male relatives, but through their own spiritual power and martial skill, who led war bands with the same deadly efficiency as any male chief, who violated every Norse assumption about the proper ordering of society. The collision between Viking patriarchal assumptions and Bjarmaland gender egalitarianism created cultural disruptions that went far beyond military encounters, challenging fundamental beliefs about nature, society, and the gods themselves, forcing Norse warriors to confront realities their worldview could not easily accommodate. Archaeological evidence from Bjarmaland burial sites tells a story radically different from Viking cemeteries, where grave goods clearly demarcate gender roles. Here, women were buried with hunting bows, shamanic drums, and leadership regalia, while men might be interred with weaving tools or cooking implements, suggesting a society where roles were distributed by aptitude rather than anatomy. The most striking evidence comes from a burial site near the White Sea, dating to approximately 950 CE, where a woman of about 35 years was interred with remarkable honors, including a ceremonial spear inlaid with silver, a bow of exceptional craftsmanship, and, most tellingly, a staff of office identical to those found in male leadership burials. Forensic analysis of her remains reveals a life of physical activity consistent with warrior training, healed fractures that suggest combat injuries, muscle attachments indicating regular bow use, and worn teeth consistent with using them to hold arrow shafts while drawing, all pointing to a life spent in active military leadership. The grave also contained items that bridged martial and spiritual authority: a shamanic drum decorated with battle scenes, amulets that combined protective magic with warrior symbolism, and arrangements of weapons that suggested ritual, as well as practical significance, indicating she wielded both temporal and spiritual power. This was not an isolated case, but part of a pattern that emerges across Bjarmaland archaeological sites. Women in positions of authority, women as warriors, women as shamans, women as traders, roles that in Viking society were exclusively or predominantly male, creating a gender landscape that Norse visitors found profoundly disturbing. The sagas, despite their cultural filters and biases, cannot avoid mentioning Bjarmaland women warriors, though they often resort to supernatural explanations or dismissive language to handle the cognitive dissonance these encounters created, calling them witches, spirits, or unnatural women, rather than simply acknowledging female military competence. One particular account from the saga of Arrow Odd describes an ambush led by a Bjarmaland woman identified only as the White Fox, whose tactical brilliance and archery skills devastated a Viking raiding party, killing their leader with a shot through his eye slit while he stood surrounded by bodyguards. A feat of marksmanship that earned grudging respect even from Norse chroniclers. The description of her appearance and behavior reveals Viking discomfort with female authority, noting she wore her hair short, like a man's, dressed in practical furs rather than women's garments, spoke with direct authority rather than feminine deference, and showed no signs of the modesty Norse culture expected from women. Yet the saga cannot hide a note of admiration, describing how she moved through the forest like smoke, how her warriors followed her commands without question, how she planned the ambush with strategic brilliance that would have earned praise if exhibited by a male leader, forcing the narrator into linguistic contortions to maintain disapproval while acknowledging effectiveness. The integration of Bjarmaland women into military operations was not token participation, but full involvement in all aspects of warfare, from strategic planning to combat leadership, creating command structures that utilize talent regardless of gender in ways that maximize their society's defensive capabilities. Training for these roles began in childhood, with archaeological evidence of practice weapons sized for children of both sexes, training areas that show no gender segregation, and coming-of-age rituals that appear to have tested skills rather than conforming to gender-predetermined paths. The psychological impact on Viking warriors of facing female opponents cannot be overstated. These were men raised in a culture where harming women was considered deeply shameful, who now faced women who would kill them without hesitation, creating moral conflicts that disrupted combat effectiveness. Some Viking accounts describe warriors hesitating fatally when confronted by female Bjarmaland fighters, unable to reconcile their training to protect women with the reality of women who posed mortal threats, paralysis that cost lives and contributed to Norse military failures. The Bjarmaland women seem to understand and exploit this psychological advantage, with accounts suggesting they deliberately positioned female fighters where Viking cultural conditioning would create maximum disruption, using Norse gender assumptions as another weapon in their arsenal. In the realm of spiritual authority, Bjarmaland women held positions that would have been inconceivable in Viking society, serving as principal shamans who conducted major rituals, intermediaries between human and spirit worlds, keepers of cultural knowledge that included both practical and esoteric wisdom. The shamanic practices associated with women often focused on transformation and mediation, rituals that moved between states and conditions, birth and death, human and animal, material and spiritual. Domains that many cultures associate with feminine power but that Bjarmaland developed to unprecedented degrees. Female shamans appeared to specialize in particular types of spiritual warfare that Vikings found especially terrifying. Rituals involving shape-shifting, weather control, and the manipulation of perception and reality, abilities that Norse sources consistently attribute to Bjarmaland wise women. The economic roles of Bjarmaland women extended beyond simple participation to leadership of trading expeditions, control over valuable resources, and negotiation of complex agreements with foreign merchants, wielding commercial power that translated into political influence. Archaeological evidence from trading sites shows distinctively female artifacts in contexts suggesting authority, specialized tools for evaluating trade goods, seals and markers indicating ownership or authentication, positioned in ways that indicate control over commercial transactions rather than subordinate participation. The impact of encountering Bjarmaland gender systems extended beyond immediate military and commercial interactions, influencing Viking culture in subtle but persistent ways, particularly in areas with sustained northern contact where Norse gender restrictions showed signs of loosening. Comparative analysis of Viking settlements near Bjarmaland territories versus those in other regions reveals interesting patterns. Slightly more egalitarian burial practices, increased representation of women in positions of local authority, and modifications to inheritance customs that provided women greater economic independence. The evolution of Norse mythology during the period of Bjarmaland contact shows increasing complexity in female divine figures, with Valkyries and other supernatural women gaining attributes that mirror reported characteristics of Bjarmaland female leaders, suggesting cultural influence through narrative adaptation. Individual Vikings who spent extended time in northern territories sometimes returned with changed attitudes toward gender roles, creating domestic conflicts when they supported greater female autonomy or questioned traditional restrictions. Though social pressure usually forced conformity to established norms, the Bjarmaland example of female military participation may have influenced the historical development of legendary shield maidens in Norse literature, providing real-world models for what had previously been purely mythological figures, though filtered through cultural lenses that maintain their exceptional rather than normal status. Marriage patterns between Vikings and Bjarmaland women, when they occurred, created complex cultural negotiations, with Norse men finding themselves in relationships where traditional gender hierarchies did not apply, forcing adaptations that chronicles describe with mixture of fascination and disapproval. Children of such unions faced particular challenges, raised between two radically different gender systems, often finding themselves unable to fully integrate into either culture, creating a population of cultural intermediaries who understood both systems but belonged fully to neither. The religious implications of Bjarmaland gender equality challenged both pagan and Christian Norse worldviews, suggesting divine sanction for arrangements that violated what Vikings considered natural order, forcing theological accommodations or rejections that influence developing northern Christianity. Documentation of Viking reactions to Bjarmaland women leaders reveals a consistent pattern of cognitive dissonance resolved through supernatural explanation, attributing female competence to witchcraft, possession, or unnatural states rather than accepting that women could naturally possess leadership and martial abilities. The practical implications for Viking military planning were significant, as commanders had to account for female participants in Bjarmaland forces, adjusting tactics and psychological preparation in ways that went against deeply ingrained cultural training about how to conduct warfare. Some Viking leaders attempted to use female intermediaries when dealing with Bjarmaland, hoping that women might communicate more effectively with female leaders, though these efforts often failed when Norse women lacked the authority and autonomy their Bjarmaland counterparts expected. The preservation of Bjarmaland gender traditions in the face of external pressure represents a remarkable example of cultural resilience, maintaining practices that violated norms of surrounding societies while using those very practices as sources of strength against encroachment. Modern archaeological techniques continue to reveal new evidence about Bjarmaland gender systems, with DNA analysis confirming biological sex of remains that grave goods suggested held non-traditional roles, validating saga accounts that historians long dismissed as fantasy or exaggeration. The influence of Bjarmaland gender egalitarianism on subsequent northern cultures can be traced through folklore, legal customs, and social practices that show greater female autonomy in regions with historical Bjarmaland contact, echoes of a system that challenged and partially transformed Viking patriarchy. The story of Bjarmaland women warriors and leaders forces us to reconsider assumptions about gender in medieval societies, demonstrating that alternative systems existed and functioned effectively, providing models that Vikings encountered, resisted, but could never entirely forget or dismiss. When Viking warriors spoke in hushed tones of the witch women of the north, who could fight like men and command the storms, they were not describing supernatural beings, but real women whose competence challenged everything Norse society taught about proper gender roles. Women whose very existence suggested that the ordered world Vikings believed in might be merely one possibility among many. The battle that changed everything. Dawn came late to the northern forests in the summer of 1026, filtering through dense canopy and patches of pale light that did little to warm the Viking warriors, who had spent another sleepless night listening to drums echoing through the trees, wondering when the attack would come, knowing that somewhere in the green darkness, eyes watched their every move. King Olaf II of Norway, later to be called Saint Olaf, though his sainthood would be earned through martyrdom rather than the mercy he showed his enemies, had assembled the largest Viking force ever to venture into Bjarmaland. 500 warriors in 15 ships, veterans of campaigns across Europe, men who had stood in the shield wall at London Bridge and charged with berserkers at Hjalmafjord. This was to be different from the raids and trading expeditions that had characterized previous Viking ventures into Bjarmaland. This was conquest, systematic subjugation of a people Olaf viewed as both an economic prize and a spiritual challenge. Pagans whose conversion would demonstrate God's power while filling Norwegian coffers with fur and ivory. The king's motivation combined religious zeal with political calculation. Recently converted to Christianity and eager to prove his faith through forced conversion of others, while also recognizing that control of Bjarmaland resources would secure his economic position and allow him to reward followers without depleting his own treasury. Preparations for the expedition had been thorough. Ships modified for river navigation, supplies calculated for extended campaign, priests included to perform conversions and sanctify conquered territory, even specialized equipment for winter warfare, showing that Olaf understood this would not be a quick summer raid. The early stages of the campaign proceeded with deceptive ease. Bjarmaland settlements along the coast abandoned before Viking arrival, their inhabitants vanishing into the forest with whatever they could carry, leaving behind empty structures that Norwegian soldiers occupied and marked with crosses. Olaf interpreted this withdrawal as fear, boasting to his men that the forest people fled before Norwegian might like deer before wolves, that soon they would corner their prey, and the wealth of the north would flow to Christian hands. God's will manifest in Viking victory, but among the older warriors, those who had ventured north before and survived, unease grew with each abandoned village, each empty storehouse, each sign that the Bjarmaland people had executed a planned withdrawal rather than panicked flight, preparing something that experience suggested would be terrible. The king pushed deeper into Bjarmaland territory than any Viking force had penetrated before, following the northern Dvina River toward what intelligence suggested was a major settlement, a place where furs were gathered and prepared for trade, where wealth accumulated before flowing south through carefully controlled channels. 20 days into the campaign, the psychological warfare intensified. Drums that beat complex rhythms all night, preventing sleep, strange lights that moved through the forest. always just out of arrow range. Viking scouts who left camp and simply vanished. Their fate unknown, but imagination supplied horrible possibilities. Morale began to crack among the rank and file. Men who had faced Saxon armies and Frankish cavalry without flinching found themselves starting at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow, whispering of curses and forest spirits, requesting that priests perform additional blessings and protections. Olaf responded with characteristic determination, doubling the watch, forbidding talk of supernatural threats, leading prayers that emphasized God's power over pagan magic, maintaining discipline through force of personality and the loyalty of his inner circle who had followed him through worse situations. The first direct contact came at a river crossing where Vikings were most vulnerable, spread out along the bank. Some men already in the water, others preparing to cross, when arrows fell from the forest like deadly rain, perfectly timed to cause maximum chaos and casualties. The Bjarmaland archers remained invisible among the trees, their positions marked only by the whisper of arrows that found gaps in armor and shields, targeting officers and specialists with uncanny accuracy, suggesting detailed intelligence about Viking command structure and combat roles. Within minutes, the crossing became a killing ground. Men in the water weighed down by equipment struggling against the current while arrows struck them. Those on shore unable to form proper shield walls in the confined space. Commanders shouting orders that were lost in the chaos of ambush. Olaf himself led a charge toward the tree line, hoping to close with the hidden archers and bring Viking advantages in close combat to bear. But the Bjarmaland fighters melted away before them, leaving only empty forest and the mocking sound of drums receding into distance. The aftermath revealed 12 dead, including 2 ship captains and the expedition's best navigator, while 20 more bore wounds that would slow future movement, forcing Olaf to reconsider his aggressive advance and establish a defensive camp while regrouping. That night, the psychological pressure increased dramatically, with what appeared to be hundreds of torches moving through the forest around the Viking camp, creating the impression of a massive force gathering, though dawn revealed no sign of large numbers, only carefully placed markers that had created illusions of movement. The next phase of the campaign saw Olaf attempting to force battle on his terms, sending out strong patrols to locate Bjarmaland forces, establishing fortified positions to control key terrain, trying to create conditions where Viking discipline and equipment would prove decisive. But the Bjarmaland refused to be drawn into conventional engagement, instead intensifying their harassment tactics, poisoning water sources upstream from Viking camps, setting forest fires that forced relocations, using their superior mobility to strike and vanish before retaliation was possible. The climactic deception came when Viking scouts reported discovering what appeared to be the main Bjarmaland settlement on an island in Lake Canozero, buildings with roofs that gleamed like precious metal in sunlight, smoke rising from numerous hearths, all signs of a prosperous community that matched intelligence reports. Olaf saw opportunity to achieve his campaign's objectives in a single decisive action: capture the settlement, seize its accumulated wealth, force the population to accept baptism, and establish a Norwegian stronghold that would control the region. Victory that would justify all losses and hardships. The king divided his forces, sending 10 ships directly toward the island while holding 5 in reserve, a tactical decision that showed both his confidence and his experience, maintaining a force to exploit success or cover withdrawal as circumstances required. As the first ships approached the island, everything seemed perfect. No resistance visible. Buildings clearly occupied. Even what appeared to be inhabitants moving between structures. encouraging Vikings who had begun to doubt whether Bjarmaland wealth existed or was merely travelers' exaggeration. The trap was sprung with devastating precision as Viking warriors disembarked, expecting at most token resistance from surprised inhabitants. Instead, finding themselves caught between hidden fighters who emerged from concealed positions and a rain of fire arrows from the surrounding shoreline. The buildings were facades, carefully constructed to appear substantial from a distance, but actually temporary structures designed to draw Vikings into a killing ground. While the real Bjarmaland forces had spent days preparing positions and ranging their weapons on the landing areas, the fire arrows carried an incendiary mixture that clung to wood and flesh, creating panic as Viking ships began to burn, forcing men to choose between staying aboard burning vessels or jumping into water where Bjarmaland archers could target them with ease. Olaf watched in horror from his reserve position as his attack disintegrated. 3 ships burning to the waterline, men screaming in the water, others trapped on the island between forces they couldn't effectively engage. His careful plan transformed into desperate survival. The king ordered his reserves forward for rescue, rather than exploitation. But, as they moved to aid their comrades, they discovered the river channel behind them had been blocked by felled trees, a massive effort that must have been accomplished while Viking attention focused on the island attack. Trapped between the killing ground of the island and the blocked retreat route, the Viking force faced annihilation, saved only by the coming of night and a desperate breakout attempt that sacrificed 2 more ships to create a gap in the river barriers, while survivors crowded onto remaining vessels. The final horror came with dawn, as a strange mist rose from the lake, carrying with it a choking, burning sensation that modern analysis suggests was sulfur dioxide from natural deposits the Bjarmaland knew how to exploit, creating a primitive chemical weapon that added to Viking casualties and terror. Of the 15 ships and 500 men who had entered Bjarmaland with such confidence, only 2 ships and fewer than 60 men escaped, including Olaf himself, who saga sources note was wounded and coughed blood for days afterward, his health never fully recovering from the experience. The Battle of Sleeping Fires, named for the banked flames that had created the sulphurous mist, represented more than a military defeat. It was the complete failure of conventional Viking warfare when confronted by an enemy who refused to fight by Norse rules and used their homeland as a weapon. The psychological impact in Viking society was profound. Here was proof that their military system, so successful across Europe, had fundamental limitations. That courage and discipline meant nothing when the enemy wouldn't stand and fight, when the very landscape became hostile, when warfare itself was transformed. Olaf never attempted another expedition to Bjarmaland, focusing instead on consolidating his Norwegian kingdom, though saga sources suggest he was haunted by memories of the northern forests, starting awake from nightmares where drums beat in darkness and arrows came from nowhere. The battle's aftermath saw a fundamental shift in Viking approach to Bjarmaland, from attempts at conquest to acceptance of regulated trade, recognition that some peoples and places could not be subdued by conventional means, that the cost of empire had limits even for the most determined conquerors. Bjarmaland's victory was not merely tactical, but strategic, demonstrating that successful resistance didn't require defeating Vikings in open battle, but making the cost of victory too high to bear, using asymmetric advantages to neutralize conventional military superiority. The techniques employed at Sleeping Fires, coordinated deception, environmental exploitation, psychological warfare, and refusal to engage on enemy terms, would influence northern warfare for generations. As other indigenous peoples learned from Bjarmaland example, For the Bjarmaland people, the victory secured their independence for generations, proving that their way of war could defeat even large-scale invasion attempts, validating their investment in environmental mastery and unconventional tactics over conventional military development. The battle entered legend on both sides, becoming a cautionary tale for Vikings about the dangers of overreach and the limits of military power, while for Bjarmaland, it became a foundation myth of successful resistance, proof that David could indeed defeat Goliath. Archaeological evidence from the battle site confirms the saga accounts in remarkable detail, with remains of burned ships, Norse weapons, and evidence of the elaborate deception that drew Vikings to their doom, validating what historians long dismissed as exaggeration. The Battle of Sleeping Fires stands as one of history's great examples of asymmetric warfare, demonstrating how perfect knowledge of terrain, innovative tactics, and psychological sophistication could overcome seemingly insurmountable disadvantages in numbers and equipment. For King Olaf, who would later be sainted for his role in Christianizing Norway, the defeat in Bjarmaland remained a source of shame and reflection, proof that even divine favor had limits when confronting an enemy who fought by entirely different rules. The last words in the saga account of the battle belong to an unnamed survivor, who told the chronicler that in the northern forests he had learned the true meaning of fear, not fear of death, which all warriors must accept, but fear of an enemy who could not be understood, predicted, or defeated by any means Vikings knew. Twilight of Two Worlds. History rarely provides clean endings, and the story of Vikings and Bjarmaland follows this pattern, not concluding with dramatic final battles or signed treaties, but fading gradually into new realities as the medieval world transformed around both cultures, making their ancient conflict increasingly irrelevant. By the 12th century, the age of Viking expansion had ended, replaced by the consolidation of Christian kingdoms in Scandinavia, the rise of new trading powers like the Hanseatic League, and the eastern expansion of Novgorod and other Russian principalities that created different pressures and opportunities. The Bjarmaland people faced their own transformations, as the fur trade that had sustained their economy faced competition from Siberian sources. As Christianity advanced inexorably northward, as the young people began to see opportunities in trading towns that offered easier lives than the harsh traditional ways, archaeological evidence from this transitional period shows fascinating adaptations. Bjarmaland settlements with Christian churches that incorporated traditional spiritual symbols, Viking trading posts with defensive features designed against threats other than Bjarmaland, suggesting former enemies finding common cause against new challenges. The old woman who leads the trading party grows older each year, noted a Hanseatic merchant in 1245, and fewer young people stand behind her to learn the ways. She says the forests grow quiet as hunters must travel ever farther to find the furs we seek, that soon none will remember the paths to the sacred places. This elegiac tone captures the gradual dissolution of traditional Bjarmaland society, not through conquest or catastrophic defeat, but through the slow erosion of young people choosing easier paths, of hunting grounds encroached upon by expanding agricultural societies, of ancient knowledge becoming irrelevant to changing times. The Vikings underwent their own cultural metamorphosis, as the fierce raiders who had terrorized Europe became conventional medieval monarchs, as the old gods gave way to Christ, as runic wisdom was replaced by Latin learning, as longships gave way to trading cogs. Former adversaries found themselves allied against common threats, with records showing Bjarmaland guides helping Norwegian expeditions against Novgorod expansion, Viking traders defending Bjarmaland merchants from Hanseatic monopolistic practices, suggesting pragmatic cooperation replacing ancient hostility. The intermarriage that had been rare during the height of conflict became more common as boundaries blurred, creating populations of mixed heritage who moved fluidly between worlds, serving as traders, translators, and cultural intermediaries who understood both traditions. Christianity's advance into Bjarmaland territories created complex syncretisms, with converts maintaining shamanic practices under Christian terminology, saints taking on attributes of forest spirits, churches built on ancient sacred sites, creating religious fusions that horrified Orthodox believers but provided cultural continuity. The last practitioners of traditional Bjarmaland warfare found their skills increasingly obsolete, as gunpowder weapons made forest ambush tactics less effective, as centralized states could mobilize resources that overwhelmed local resistance, as the very forests that had provided sanctuary were cleared for timber and farmland. Some Bjarmaland communities migrated deeper into the Arctic, seeking to preserve their ways in regions too remote for southern interference, joining related peoples like the Sami in maintaining traditional lifestyles, though increasingly marginalized from economic and political power. Others adapted to new realities, transforming from semi-nomadic hunters to settled farmers or town dwellers, maintaining what cultural elements they could while accepting that the old ways could not survive unchanged, creating hybrid identities that preserved memory, if not practice. The transformation of Viking society was equally profound, as former raiders became merchants and administrators, as the martial values that had driven expansion gave way to commercial calculation and diplomatic negotiation, as saga heroes were replaced by careful kings who counted coins rather than battle honors. The economic networks that had connected Vikings and Bjarmaland evolved into more conventional trade relationships, with former territorial boundaries becoming administrative districts, traditional trading posts becoming permanent towns, seasonal markets becoming year-round commercial centers. Documentation from this period shows gradual linguistic assimilation, with Bjarmaland languages incorporating Norse loanwords for new concepts and technologies, while regional Nordic dialects absorbed Bjarmaland terms for environmental features and traditional practices, creating linguistic fossils of cultural exchange. The role of women in these transforming societies showed interesting divergences, with Bjarmaland gender egalitarianism gradually eroding under Christian influence, while Viking societies near former Bjarmaland territories showed slightly more female autonomy than southern regions, suggesting bidirectional cultural influence. Religious transformation created generational conflicts in both societies, as young converts rejected ancestral practices while elders struggled to maintain traditions, creating family dramas repeated across the North as old and new worldviews competed for allegiance. The material culture of this transitional period shows fascinating hybridizations. Viking metalwork incorporating Bjarmaland decorative motifs. Bjarmaland clothing adopting Norse construction techniques. Architectural styles blending both traditions in structures that served new purposes. Legal systems evolved to handle the complexities of formerly hostile peoples, now living in closer proximity, with law codes incorporating elements from both traditions, creating precedents for handling intercultural disputes that would influence Northern European legal development. The preservation of cultural memory took different forms in each society. Vikings writing down sagas that transformed historical conflicts into legendary adventures. Bjarmaland maintaining oral traditions that encoded practical knowledge in mythological narratives. both creating idealized pasts that served present needs. Educational practices showed the strain of transformation, as Viking societies established Latin schools that displaced traditional skaldic training, while Bjarmaland communities struggled to maintain knowledge transmission systems when young people no longer lived traditional lifestyles. The economic transformation was particularly profound for Bjarmaland peoples, as the fur trade that had provided leverage against Viking expansion became controlled by large commercial organizations, reducing them from independent traders to hired trappers in increasingly exploitative relationships. Environmental changes added another pressure, as climate fluctuations affected animal populations, as agricultural expansion reduced hunting territories, as resource extraction for distant markets disrupted ecological balances that traditional practices had maintained for millennia. The final dispersal of distinct Bjarmaland identity occurred not through dramatic events, but through countless individual decisions. Young people choosing town life over forest hardship, families converting for social advantage, communities fragmenting as economic bases disappeared. By the 14th century, identifying distinct Bjarmaland communities became increasingly difficult, as cultural boundaries blurred through intermarriage, religious conversion, and economic integration, with former enemies becoming neighbors barely distinguishable from surrounding populations. The Vikings, as a distinct cultural phenomenon, had similarly vanished, absorbed into the broader European medieval civilization, their ancestors' raids becoming distant memories, celebrated in literature but irrelevant to contemporary life, their special characteristics diluted through centuries of cultural exchange. The legacy of their conflict persisted in subtle ways, in place, names that recalled ancient boundaries, in folk tales that preserved garbled memories of forest ambushes and supernatural terrors, in legal customs that reflected long-ago accommodations between different ways of life. Archaeological investigation continues to reveal new evidence about this forgotten confrontation, each excavation adding details that complicate simplistic narratives, showing that the relationship between Vikings and Bjarmaland was always more complex than simple antagonism. Modern descendants of both peoples often remain unaware of their ancestral conflict, living peacefully in regions where their forebears killed each other with passionate intensity. The ancient hatreds dissolved by time and transformation into historical curiosity. The environmental knowledge that gave Bjarmaland such advantages survives partially in traditional practices maintained by indigenous Arctic peoples. Wisdom about reading weather, tracking animals, surviving extreme cold that echoes ancient skills. Though divorced from their military applications, Viking maritime technology evolved into peaceful applications, their shipbuilding innovations contributing to European naval development, their navigation techniques becoming standard practice, their expansionist energy channeled into commercial rather than military ventures. The stories told about this conflict evolved with each telling, Vikings becoming more heroic or villainous depending on the narrator, Bjarmaland defenders transformed into supernatural beings or noble savages, both reduced to caricatures that served contemporary purposes rather than historical accuracy. Academic study of Viking Bjarmaland interaction challenges popular understanding of the Viking Age, revealing that Norse expansion had clear limits, that military superiority could be neutralized by environmental adaptation, that smaller peoples could successfully resist incorporation into expanding empires. The gender dynamics revealed by this history continue to provoke discussion. As evidence of Bjarmaland, women warriors contradicts assumptions about universal patriarchy in medieval societies. suggesting alternative social organizations that functioned effectively, inspiring modern reconsiderations of historical gender roles. Economic historians find in the fur trade patterns that preceded later colonial resource extraction, with Bjarmaland-resistant strategies providing models for how indigenous peoples could maintain some autonomy within exploitative systems, lessons relevant to understanding later historical periods. Military theorists study Bjarmaland tactics as early examples of successful asymmetric warfare, demonstrating principles later codified in guerrilla warfare manuals, showing how environmental mastery and psychological operations could defeat conventionally superior forces. The religious syncretism that emerged from Christian conversion of both peoples created unique northern traditions. Saints who controlled weather like shamans, Christian rituals performed at ancient sacred sites, theological adaptations that horrified Orthodox authorities but provided cultural continuity. Climate change makes Bjarmaland adaptation strategies newly relevant, as Arctic warming threatens ways of life dependent on ice and cold, as southern populations face environmental challenges requiring similar ingenuity, as ancient wisdom about surviving extremes gains modern applications. The transformation of conflict into cooperation between former enemies provides historical precedent for modern peace-building efforts, showing how economic interdependence and external threats could override ancestral hostilities, creating pragmatic alliances between former foes. Cultural preservation efforts by modern indigenous peoples draw inspiration from Bjarmaland resistance, seeing in their successful defense of autonomy models for maintaining identity against globalizing pressures. Though recognizing that complete isolation is neither possible nor desirable, the archaeological sites that tell this story face their own threats, from development pressure, climate change, and looting, requiring protection efforts that balance research needs with preservation, ensuring future generations can learn from physical evidence of this forgotten conflict. Tourism to regions where Vikings and Bjarmaland once clashed creates economic opportunities, but also challenges, as simplified narratives for visitors risk overwriting complex histories, requiring careful interpretation that respects both people's experiences and achievements. The languages that once divided these peoples have largely vanished or transformed beyond recognition, with only linguistic fossils in place, names and borrowed words testifying to ancient interactions, requiring detective work to reconstruct communication patterns. Modern genetic studies reveal the biological legacy of Viking-Bjarmaland interaction, with DNA evidence of intermarriage patterns that historical sources barely mention, showing that despite conflict, human connections transcended cultural boundaries. The lessons from this history remain relevant, demonstrating that military technology and numerical superiority do not guarantee victory, that environmental knowledge provides crucial advantages, that psychological factors can outweigh physical force, that resistance takes many forms. For the Vikings, the encounter with Bjarmaland represented a crucial lesson in limits, showing that their expansion would eventually meet peoples and places that could not be conquered, forcing adaptations that ultimately transformed Viking culture itself. For the Bjarmaland, their successful resistance came at a cost, as the effort required to maintain independence against Viking pressure may have prevented other developments, leaving them vulnerable when new threats emerged that their traditional strategies couldn't address. The interaction between these peoples created innovations on both sides, Vikings adapting to forest warfare, Bjarmaland incorporating useful technologies, both learning from conflict in ways that enriched their cultures even as they struggled for dominance. The storytelling traditions of both cultures preserved different versions of their conflict, each emphasizing their own courage and cleverness, while acknowledging their opponents' formidable qualities, creating parallel narratives that historians must carefully balance. Modern indigenous rights movement find precedent in Bjarmaland resistance, legal arguments citing historical autonomy, cultural preservation efforts drawing on examples of successful resistance, political strategies inspired by asymmetric success against dominant powers, the environmental destruction that ultimately undermined Bjarmaland ways of life preceded industrial exploitation, showing how even pre-modern resource extraction could devastate ecosystems, providing historical warnings about sustainability and conservation. Educational curricula slowly incorporate this complex history, challenging simplistic narratives of Viking dominance, introducing students to alternative perspectives on medieval Northern Europe, fostering understanding of how different cultures could clash yet coexist. The artistic legacy of both cultures continues to inspire, Viking metalwork and Bjarmaland textile patterns influencing modern design, their mythologies providing material for contemporary literature and media. Though often simplified beyond recognition, museums struggle with presenting this history accurately, balancing visitor expectations, shaped by popular culture with scholarly understanding, creating exhibits that respect both cultures while acknowledging the violence and tragedy of their conflict. The seasonal patterns that once structured both societies have largely vanished, replaced by industrial timekeeping and global commerce, though echoes remain in holiday traditions and cultural practices that recall ancient relationships with natural cycles. Modern residents of former Bjarmaland territories often combine ancestries from both peoples, living testimonies to eventual reconciliation, their mixed heritage reflecting centuries of conflict and accommodation that shaped Northern European populations. The skills that made Bjarmaland warriors formidable have evolved into peaceful applications, traditional tracking becoming wildlife biology, forest knowledge supporting sustainable forestry, weather reading contributing to climate science, ancient wisdom finding new purposes, Viking entrepreneurial spirit similarly transformed from raiding to trading. Their risk-taking and exploration drive channeling into business ventures and technological innovation, aggressive expansion becoming economic competition within legal frameworks. The spiritual practices of both cultures left traces in modern Northern spirituality, from Lutheran churches with shamanic symbols to neo-pagan movements attempting to reconstruct ancient beliefs, showing how religious traditions evolve while maintaining connections to deep past. Contemporary conflict resolution studies examine Viking-Bjarmaland interaction for insights, how intractable conflicts eventually transform, what conditions enable former enemies to become trading partners, which strategies promote lasting peace versus temporary truces. The role of climate in shaping this conflict gains new relevance as modern societies face environmental challenges. Bjarmaland adaptation to extreme conditions providing models for resilience. Their fate, warning about vulnerability to climate change. International law concepts trace partially to medieval northern trade agreements, including Viking-Bjarmaland protocols, showing how commercial necessity created legal frameworks that transcended cultural differences, establishing precedents for managing hostile trade relationships. The psychological warfare techniques, pioneered by Bjarmaland shamans, influenced regional conflict patterns, creating traditions of supernatural intimidation that persisted in Northern European warfare, showing how effective tactics spread across cultures despite their exotic origins. Gender historians find in Bjarmaland society evidence challenging universal patriarchy narratives, their female warriors and leaders demonstrating alternative social organizations, inspiring examination of how gender roles varied across medieval societies, the economic networks connecting Vikings and Bjarmaland to global markets preceded modern globalization, showing how luxury goods could create commercial relationships spanning continents, furs from Arctic forests adorning Byzantine courtiers, demonstrating ancient economic interdependence. Environmental historians trace ecosystem changes to medieval fur trade pressures. Bjarmaland, hunting affecting animal populations. Viking, demand driving unsustainable extraction, showing how pre-industrial commerce could damage environments. Lessons relevant to contemporary conservation. The transformation of both societies demonstrates history's complexity, how conflicts resolve not through victory but through mutual transformation. Enemies becoming ancestors of shared descendants, ancient hatreds dissolving into historical curiosity, time healing wounds that seemed eternal. As we conclude this exploration of Vikings and Bjarmaland, we see not simple heroes and villains, but complex societies struggling to survive and thrive in challenging environments, their conflict producing innovations and adaptations that enriched human experience despite its tragic costs. The Bjarmaland people proved that David could indeed defeat Goliath, not through miraculous intervention but through intelligence, adaptation, and refusal to accept others' rules of engagement, showing that power comes in many forms, not all involving swords and ships. The Vikings learned that expansion had limits, that courage and technology could not overcome all obstacles, and that some peoples and places demanded respect rather than conquest. Lessons that transformed their culture from raiders to traders, and ultimately to modern Scandinavians. Both peoples left legacies beyond their specific cultures, contributing to human understanding of survival, resistance, adaptation, and transformation, showing how conflict could produce innovation, how difference could enrich rather than merely divide. The forests where they once fought have largely vanished, replaced by cities and farms, the skills they perfected becoming obsolete or transformed, their gods forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. Yet, something essential remains in landscape and memory. When winter winds howl through northern forests, one can almost hear echoes of ancient conflicts, drums beating in darkness, arrows whistling through snow-laden air, voices calling in languages no longer spoken, ghosts of Vikings and Bjarmaland still contesting territories of imagination. Their story reminds us that history holds more complexity than simple narratives suggest, that every conquest has its limits, every resistance its costs, every conflict its eventual resolution through transformation rather than victory, time accomplishing what warfare cannot. The greatest monument to both peoples may be that their descendants live peacefully in lands once contested with blood and terror, ancient enemies becoming modern neighbors, their children playing together where warriors once died, proving that no conflict truly lasts forever. In the end, both Vikings and Bjarmaland achieved forms of immortality, not through permanent victory but through contributing to human diversity, showing different ways of living, fighting, believing, and adapting, enriching our collective heritage through their very differences. The forgotten tribe that terrified the Vikings deserves remembrance not for military prowess alone, but for demonstrating that alternative ways of life could successfully resist incorporation into expanding empires, that environmental mastery could trump technological superiority, that smaller peoples could maintain autonomy against overwhelming odds. Let their story inspire modern underdogs facing powerful opponents, showing that asymmetric advantages exist for those clever enough to find them, that psychological factors matter as much as physical force, that resistance takes many forms, not all requiring conventional strength. Let it also humble those who assume technological or numerical superiority guarantees success, reminding that every strength creates weaknesses. Every assumption provides opportunities for surprise. Every empire meets its limits somewhere, often where least expected. The Vikings and Bjarmaland have passed into history, their conflicts resolved by time's passage rather than decisive victory, their descendants barely aware of ancient hostilities. Yet their interaction created ripples still spreading through human consciousness, lessons still relevant, wisdom still applicable. When we face our own conflicts and challenges, may we remember both Vikings and Bjarmaland, drawing courage from their examples while learning from their limitations, understanding that all human struggles eventually transform into history, that today's enemies may be tomorrow's ancestors. The forests are quiet now, where once drums beat and warriors crept through snow. The old gods sleep beneath Christian churches and modern developments. The ancient skills survive only in fragments and memories. Yet, something essential remains for those who know how to look. In every successful resistance against overwhelming odds, in every transformation of conflict into cooperation, in every preservation of cultural identity against homogenizing pressures, the spirits of Bjarmaland warriors and Viking raiders live on, their ancient struggle echoing through eternity. Their story ends not with conquest or defeat, but with transformation. Both peoples becoming something new while contributing to humanity's rich tapestry, proving that history's greatest victories may be mutual survival rather than dominance. That time accomplishes what warfare cannot. May their memory inspire us to find strength in our differences, wisdom in our environments, and courage in defending what we value, while remaining open to transformation when circumstances change, learning from ancestors who faced impossible odds with determination and intelligence. The forgotten tribe that terrified the Vikings has not truly been forgotten, living on in every successful resistance, every creative adaptation, every refusal to accept others' rules when they threaten survival. Their legacy preserved not in monuments, but in human spirit itself. And so the story ends where it began, in the frozen forests of the far north, where two peoples met in conflict and created something neither expected, a tale of terror and respect, resistance and adaptation, showing that history's most important lessons often come from its most overlooked chapters.